Hello, I'm Britt Garner.
And I'm Rob Spall.
Welcome to Nature Insight.
Speed dating with the future. This is the first episode of our new podcast series. We're going to be sharing the latest thinking about biodiversity with unique perspectives from those on the front lines of research, policy, and action. So Britt, I'm all set up here in Germany, in Bonn. I have a makeshift studio that we've sandwiched in between some old moving boxes into our attic. And my 6-year-old daughter has even given us an hour of quiet so we can do the recording. How are things going in Montana in the US?
That is very kind of her. Over here in Montana, I've got approximately 7 plus or minus 800 lawnmowers going at the same time. So I'm hoping that won't be too much of a problem. But, COVID-19 means that most of us are all kind of in our own spaces right now. But the wonderful thing about podcasts and about media is that we're still able to tell stories. Every week on Nature Insight, we're going to be meeting incredible individuals whose experience can help us see solutions for the future of humans and nature, but from different perspectives. We are kind of speed dating with the future, aren't we, Rob?
Yes, it's kind of in the same way that real speed dating challenges us to make a lasting and positive impression in just a few moments. We're going to try and impress upon you, our listeners, the incredible importance of biodiversity and nature's contributions to people by bringing a few minutes of insight every week from some of the people who are part of the wider community of the organization that I work for, IPBES.
IPBES, right. IPBES stands for the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. I got it out in one breath. I am so thrilled.
Very impressive. We bring the best available evidence, the best available science to the attention of people who really need it to make better choices. IPBES, as you know, will usually focus our communications on decision makers, but the truth is every person is a decision maker in their own lives, and we're all really personally affected by the changes we're making to nature and to biodiversity.
You and I are separated by an entire ocean right now. We are in the same species, and yet our habitats are vastly different. And I think it'd actually be really cool if we could share with each other some pieces of our habitats. And it just so happens I recorded some audio of this exact thing to be able to share with you. So that is rain. And as earth-shattering as that sound might seem, here in Montana, it actually is quite a symbol of the changing of the seasons. The fact that water outside is now in liquid form instead of in solid form. In the midst of COVID-19 and in the midst of our own kind of personal lives, it reminds me that the seasons are changing, and it's a wonderful reminder. It really keeps me grounded. Another thing that really keeps me grounded is something special that happens in Missoula, Montana, where I am, and I'm going to share that with you now. Wolves, you might say. People, you might say. A combination of both. So that is actually every night at 8 p.m. People in Missoula open their windows or go to their front porches for the last 2 months to support our frontline workers. And what an interesting thing, though, that our species uses inspiration from another species to connect to ourselves.
I love both of your choices of sounds. I really like the idea of the rain symbolizing change, because in some ways it does, and it reminds us of change, but it's a reminder of constance as well as of change. And I think we've had a lot of that in nature recently, that we're dealing with things we weren't expecting, but they're things that perhaps we should have been expecting. We have some sounds from my own neighborhood that we've been experiencing during lockdown, and they've had a rather different feel. So what you were hearing in that clip was the sounds of the beautiful bird life which we have outside in our garden, and we're so lucky to have that. But then what you heard was the sounds of our local construction workers who apparently don't labor under the same restrictions that the rest of us do during lockdown, and who continued to work every single day, and particularly every single morning of lockdown. So while you had howling at 8 o'clock every night. We had construction starting at 6:30, which is not always such a welcome reminder of the work that's being done outside, but it was certainly an interesting way to be waking up during lockdown.
You know, I kind of love the idea of construction and of bird songs because I think from the human perspective, bird songs can feel like the lovely walk in the woods, I am Snow White and there are squirrels doing my hair up right now sort of feel. But really, for all we know, the birds themselves are doing construction, right? That conversation could be, excuse me, I'd really love if you move that branch the tiniest bit to the left, trying to make a nest here, people, right? It's just all about perspective. I think that kind of everyone's worldview probably has shifted in these last few months. And so we're really excited to be able to kick off this entire series by introducing you all to someone who's thought really deeply about the connection between biodiversity and the situation the world currently finds itself in.
Yes, I was really lucky to catch up with one of our busiest colleagues. His name is Dr. Peter Daszak, and Peter is one of the world's leading zoologists. He's also an expert on disease ecology, which is one of the reasons he's been so busy during the COVID-19 pandemic. He's the president of the EcoHealth Alliance, which is a non-profit, non-governmental organization which supports global health. And he's helping us at IPBES plan a new expert assessment that we're working on about the links between biodiversity, health, and food. He really couldn't be better placed to talk about the situation that we found ourselves in over the last couple of months. Just to kick things off a little bit, and again, a big thanks for being our first episode. One of the things that strikes me, I guess, is that you've been doing an inordinate number of interviews and online conversations and podcasts over the last couple of weeks, almost to the point now where doing it remotely is almost got to be second nature for you. But I had a question which was, where are you sitting and where should you have been had COVID-19 not hit us?
Well, I'm in Rockland County, which is just outside New York City. Last week, I should have been at a meeting on climate change and health in Washington, D.C. This week, I should have been in Malaysia at a meeting on infectious diseases and preventing pandemics. So it is ironic. I mean, one good thing is I'm reducing my global footprint by not traveling as much, but I'm really missing the face-to-face communication with colleagues and the brainstorming and the, thinking about our future. But lockdown is hard. It's hard to keep your discipline, but it's a lot harder for people who are stuck in places where there is no green space outside to walk in or have to stay in their apartments 24/7. It's really tough.
Given that there are so many people under lockdown and who are really feeling the brunt of all of this at the moment, and there are so many of us who are actually scared and who are frustrated or deeply uncertain about the future, are we right to be blaming nature for this? Is it nature that we should be pointing the finger at bats and at pangolins and snakes and others for the impacts on our lives?
Yeah, I feel really sorry for bats in particular that they're getting blamed. I mean, already they've got such a bad rap in films and TV shows and books. They're just going about their daily business, doing what they've done for millions of years. And what's happened is our population's expanded to the point we're reaching out into every single habitat. We're eating them, we're cutting down the trees they live in, we're invading the caves that they inhabit. And as a byproduct of that, we get exposed to the viruses they've carried for millions of years, which do no harm to them and unfortunately kill us. It's really our fault, actually, if we want to point the blame.
You stand in a very unique intersection. I mean, you have one foot or one leg in the science of infectious diseases. You have another leg in biodiversity and in nature. How did you end up making a career out of studying these links between nature and infectious diseases? Because it doesn't seem to spring to mind as the obvious career path for a young person, certainly not before we had the COVID-19 pandemic.
I wanted to be a zoologist when I was a kid. Since I was a very young boy, I was really into nature, I loved animals. And that's where I knew I wanted to work with animals. In the Amazon was my dream. I went to university, I did a zoology degree, and I kind of realized halfway through, there aren't that many jobs for zoologists. In fact, I don't think people even do zoology degrees now. But I changed to applied zoology, and a lot of it was parasitology, which was fascinating. The idea that one group of animals lives inside another and uses it and changes its behavior. Like toxoplasma that makes people take risks, go outside more, and therefore are able to spread the infection to other hosts. It's just fascinating. And I just knew then that that's what I wanted to work on. I wanted to understand why that happens and how we can stop it. The link to wildlife has been a constant throughout my work, and it's a constant throughout pandemics. Every single pandemic has a link to wildlife. Either the virus came from wildlife or the pathogen, or genetic components of it came from wildlife, like influenza. They're all linked to human anthropogenic environmental changes. They emerge through the connections we make to nature. We cut down a forest, we put a pig farm there, the pigs get exposed, we get a new virus. These things have happened and will happen unless we change the way we do that. So, the connections are there. It's a really rich field, and everything we do in this field is new, and there are very few people working on it. And that's another thing that's so fascinating. You really do feel like you're pioneering new work.
So you're relatively uniquely positioned, or experts like yourself are very uniquely positioned to be able to give us a perspective we don't otherwise have at this moment, given how close we are to the pandemic. Has anything about the COVID-19 pandemic been a surprise to you, or is this something you've taken almost in stride?
No, I think everybody's shocked at how quickly it got out of China and became a global issue. We're going to see some countries and some communities really hit hard, and the pandemic is going to persist in those communities. The science tells us that we should treat each person equally in the face of this pandemic, or we're at risk. That's exactly it. It's people in the favelas of Rio that can't do social distancing. It's prisoners. It's the poor, the folks who have to go out and work. They're already being hit hard. People of colour, the disenfranchised, the immigrants who were never properly documented, who live in townships on the edge of cities. And I think what's going to be incredibly important is to make the point, the political point. If the outbreak persists in any community, the outbreak persists in our community, because it will spike again and then we will be at risk. We're going to have to share a lot more. We're going to have to be far more equitable about the resources we have to beat these things down. And we're not doing that yet.
Up until this point in sort of modern history, at least, we've almost become accustomed to the idea of a global north and a global south. But here there's almost a moment where, although there is the disparity in the way the impacts are happening, it really is something that affects, as you say, all of us, no matter which community it's in. And I'm wondering if issues of equity and division are not going to be somehow redefined by what we've been going through.
In the northern latitudes, we see less emerging diseases. They don't originate there because there's less wildlife diversity. So it's very simple. Wildlife carry viruses, and those viruses are the ones that become pandemic if we make contact with them. So a country like, let's say, Indonesia, with incredible diversity, is more likely to be the origin of a new virus because there are more viruses in those wildlife. So in the richer countries of the north, we think pandemics are a kind of over there problem. West African Ebola, HIV originated out of Africa. This is a Chinese virus. This is the mantra we hear. But of course, there are two things that's wrong with that. Number one, when a pathogen gets into an air travel system, it instantly gravitates to the countries that travel the most. They're the richer countries. They're the US, Europe, Japan, Australia, China. Number two, the things that cause pandemics are rampant economic development in countries with high biodiversity. And that's usually driven by consumption demands from the richer countries. Palm oil, rare earth elements for iPhones. This sort of thing is driving deforestation, which is a globally significant cause of pandemics. So it's ironic that in the north, we think of it as an over there problem. It's caused by us. When they emerge, they come straight to us. Until we accept that, we're not going to really deal with this problem.
I was reading that as early as 2018, I think you and a group of other experts had talked about disease X, and you had predicted this idea of disease X, that a new pandemic would be likely to emerge from animals to humans, and that it would affect many countries. It would have high death rates, at least as high as the seasonal flu, and at least as great a level of ease of spread of that. So is COVID-19 disease X?
Oh, yeah, and it's just the first of the disease X's we're going to see in the future. We called it X for X the unknown, in equations. The idea that there are diseases out there that we've not yet encountered. We estimate 1.7 million viruses in wildlife that could emerge in the future. Most of them won't be able to become pandemic, but there will be lots that can. And, it's just crazy to sit here and worrying about this pandemic and not get ready for those others that are ready, willing, and able to emerge. Because let's face it, we've been here before. We had Ebola from West Africa, we had H1N1 flu, HIV, AIDS. We don't have vaccines to most of those pathogens. We're not protected really from the next one, which could be a new pathogen. So let's get ready and let's understand why these things happen.
You've got to focus in the work that you're doing, collaborating with IPBES, on this new study, this Nexus study, which looks at the intersections between biodiversity, nature loss, health, and food in the broader context of climate change. Given these connections, do you feel that we've still got a long way to go in terms of these silos that tend to be built up between decision makers and those who are taking broader development type decisions or deciding on investment areas? One of the things that has struck, I think, me and a number of the people who work with IPBES is this idea of this whole systemic approach, the need to look more widely than just one particular area or subset of an economy.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's why the Nexus is such a good strategy. The reason pandemics emerge are complex interrelationships between socioeconomic factors and how those change gradually over decades. Biodiversity and environmental change and how they change gradually over decades. These are not easy things to study. You need interdisciplinary work. You need multi-decadal research to understand them. And they're really hard to explain to policymakers who are busy and have a specific agenda around health or around the environment. To connect the two is really hard. And we've been trying for many years. There are many ways to do this. This pandemic will help do that. I think that in a bunch of ways. One way, straight away to the public. They read what's out there. They see that in North India, we can now see the Himalayas for the first time in years because of air pollution dropping, because we're on this global pause. They can read the newspaper reports about being able to see the bottom of the rivers in Venice and the canals because of the lack of traffic there. That's a positive thing. It shows us a glimpse of a new future that we can get to if we undergo transformative change.
So you're not a sociologist, but I'm going to ask you a sociological type question. Is there a horrible lesson in all this? Do people have to have a personal dire impact on them or their close families to change behaviors or change choices? And does that depress you?
No, it doesn't depress me. It's disappointing. I'm disappointed by our species. Politicians care about the health of their children and their voters much more than they care about you saying, please conserve Spix's macaw. It's a beautiful blue parrot that's on the edge of extinction. Okay, I've never heard of it and I don't care, is the answer. Please reduce our environmental footprint in Malaysia because the dengue outbreak this year has killed 10% of your voters and the next year outbreak is going to get worse. Okay, let's get a task force. Let's deal with it. That's the response we see when we go around the world and talk with policymakers in different countries. And we unabashedly, unreservedly, and openly use health to push the conservation agenda. I see it as a win-win. It's a collateral benefit of a health program if you do it right. If we can shift the agenda and say, look, protecting the planet is good for your health. If we change the language so that it's all around health, but it gets to these underlying causes, we will win the day. But it won't be easy.
Is it possible to ever eliminate the risk of pandemics?
I don't think so. I mean, I think this is part of our everyday life at doing business on the planet. With so many people out there doing so much on the ground, we're going to always be at risk, but we can definitely reduce this in a significant way. You know, we've done some analysis of people in rural China of how often they get exposed to these bat origin coronaviruses. We estimate between 1 and 7 million people a year are exposed, i.e. get infected. And those aren't people working in the wildlife trade. They're people in rural Southeast Asia, sheltering in a bat cave from the rain, using bat guano to fertilize the crops, just like in England we used to use horse manure to fertilize our crops. These are traditional people living traditional lives. That's not going to change significantly, but there are things we can do to understand those behaviors and protect them and do it in a way that's culturally sensitive. That's what needs to happen. It's not going to be easy work. It's not a simple pill or an injection, but it's a reality check on what we're doing on the planet and how we can do it better.
I really appreciate that, and I share your eternal optimism in almost all things. I think it's probably fair to say that in the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a real development of this idea of really take a lot more seriously and give a lot more credibility to Indigenous and local knowledge and to the insights of local communities and Indigenous peoples. To what extent does this idea of that you've talked about, of looking at the at-risk communities, to what extent do we need to be listening to these communities as opposed to just going in and trying to assist communities?
It's quite interesting, actually. I mean, not all Indigenous communities, but many are disenfranchised and are the groups that will probably, some of the groups that will be hit hardest by the pandemic because they just don't have the access to healthcare for whatever reason, political, social, or just physical geography, distance, to fight the outbreak. So that's one thing. And look, we've already seen incredible activism within some Indigenous communities around health issues, whether that's the health impacts of an oil well that's polluting the rivers or mercury in fish in the Amazon. We need to listen to them and we need to support them where we can and where it makes sense. There's a real potential for that to change the agenda because, of course, many of the areas set aside by governments for Indigenous peoples are high biodiversity in the tropics, are remote areas. They're exactly the places where pandemics could emerge if those areas are mismanaged. So we could look at that as a way to a sort of health protection, if you like. And that could be a language shift and an agenda shift when we talk to politicians who are need persuading on those issues in some countries.
It's a bit of a thorny issue because I remember when I used to work with the ministry in South Africa, one of the things that was always a challenge for us is if, for instance, there was a reduction in the quotas for catches of a particular fish species in a given year, there was always a counter need to find ways of helping communities that depended on that particular species economically for livelihoods to have other sustainable economic activities or help them create economic growth in an area that is more sustainable. And I suspect there's similar types of things here where you have communities who are perhaps engaged in direct development issues or direct deforestation issues, as you say, for livelihood purposes. And we would perhaps need to be looking at alternative economic opportunities that would be more sustainable in those communities.
Yeah, and I think there's a really urgent issue with this pandemic around the wildlife trade. There are conservation groups out there calling for a ban to the wildlife trade. Naive and kind of irresponsible. I mean, some communities depend on wildlife for nutritional impact. They're going to suffer horrifically if that now becomes illegal. And it's also naive to think that it's going to be supported when some of these habits are 5,000 years of deep culture and tradition where a certain meal is highly valued by a community. Often it could be harvested sustainably or even those animals could be bred in farms. So there are ways to do this that are more sensitive to the need of Indigenous peoples and local communities to continue their traditions and beliefs without a sort of knee-jerk reaction of let's ban it. A ban would also drive it underground. We've seen that already in parts of Southeast Asia. And if there's an outbreak from an underground trade, it's even harder to find the first few cases. So let's not go there, please. I really think we need to, actually, as you said, we need to first listen to local communities, why they do this, why they want to do that, and what the alternatives could be, what incentives are there. Then let's support that.
To reduce the risks, as opposed to eliminate the risks of future pandemics, what are the kinds of conversations that need to be taking place in all kinds of societies, in all areas of societies that aren't taking place at the moment? What are we not talking about?
We're not linking our activities to this pandemic or any future pandemic. That's the real problem. Pandemics are rare events. Even smaller outbreaks of new emerging diseases, we estimate there are about 5 new ones a year that emerge. It's not every day that you come across a bat virus in your backyard that's killing your neighbours. It's just a bizarre situation. But it happens. And when it happens, it's utterly devastating. We need to link that back to our behaviours. My iPhone is part of the problem because the metals that I need for a computer or for a phone now are mined out of the forests of New Guinea and Africa. And some outbreaks happen in those activities. So let's understand that our consumption drives this and that we're at risk. If we understand that and reduce our consumption just a little bit, everyone can do this. We can start a little movement, just reducing consumption for a better world, for a healthier planet.
I think something which we've all become critically aware of in the last few months has been that there are individual actions that as a combination and together really can actually add up to make a significant change or a big difference. And that's something, again, the idea of transformative change and change that is system-wide change can be daunting for some people. It can be this vast concept, or it can be something that they say somebody else can take care of it. I don't need to worry about it. And I think one of the keys for transformative change is that it does need to happen at all levels, at all scales, even at the very individual personal level.
And we can show leadership with that too. You know, we can show leadership as the environmental community, as the health community, in ways to avoid pandemics in the future. So let's also change behaviors around the dinner table. Let's eat a little bit less meat, a little bit more vegetables. That's pretty good for your own personal health, but it's also good for planetary health. Let's stick our neck out a little bit, all of us, and start trying to protect the planet from these things.
It's a great call to action for all of us in the whole community. Peter, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your perspectives, your expertise with us. And it's been such a great pleasure chatting to you about all of this.
Always a pleasure.
So that interview was recorded towards the middle of April this year, which was obviously right in the middle of the pandemic itself and where it was hitting its peaks in a lot of countries. I think since then, obviously, there have been some changes in some of the countries that started earlier, but I think a lot of that is still very valid, particularly the elements that talk to what we should be thinking about in terms of the next pandemic and the risks of future pandemics.
Certainly. And the thing that really stuck with me was the idea of, pandemics emerge from our interactions with nature. And also the way that you started the whole thing off, asking, is nature to blame? And this always makes me go 100 miles an hour thinking about how useful it is to really give that demarcation between humans and nature. Is it nature to blame or humans? Well, humans are nature, right? Like we are another species on the landscape interacting. And so the answer is yes, nature is to blame in terms of us, like our species is responsible for our species' health, but also the health of so many other non-human species as well. When I hear him discuss the way that disease is transmitted and the way that interactions and our interactions with habitats, whether that's fragmentation or habitat destruction, leads to pandemic, we do that for non-humans as well. I think about white nose syndrome in bats. How amazing is it to think that we are blaming bats for this particular virus, and we ourselves are responsible for viruses and diseases in bats. It doesn't go just one way. It absolutely goes both ways.
So one of the things that always sticks with me about the results of the global assessment, it pointed to direct drivers of change in nature. Things like the changes in land use and sea use, changes in the way which we're polluting our environment, changes in climate change, changes in alien invasive species. But it also pointed to indirect drivers of change, where it looked at things like global production and consumption patterns. It looked at population dynamics, global trade. And then it took an even further step back where it said underlying all of those, values and behaviors. And I think really if we're going to holistically address some of these problems, if we're going to start addressing issues like pandemic risk, we can't do it piecemeal. We can't look at it on the basis of which of the direct drivers are we going to address and perhaps some of the indirect drivers. It has to be a holistic picture.
Oh, I completely agree. And it's funny, he was talking about majors in college. And for the record, I got my bachelor's degree in zoology, so I can confirm it is still a degree. But that said, my work since then, right now I'm actually doing a PhD in interdisciplinary studies. I started with wildlife biology, and I realized as I went, this doesn't quite hit all the questions I'm asking. And so now I am still looking at international policy and wildlife biodiversity, but I've included environmental philosophy and I've included communication. And I even have members on my committee that are vocal performance and theater professors, all within the idea of storytelling and the ways that we construct the ideas of the world around us and then how we then can go from there. So I love that the I word came into this, interdisciplinary. I think it's so important.
And what really ties that together is the concept of what has value for each of us as individuals
Yes.
and in our professions and in our communities. Do we value the contributions, whether we realize we're getting them or not, sufficiently from nature? Do we value it enough to take that into account when we make decisions about and affecting nature? And this is why when IPBES was deciding what its next work program was going to look at, there is now a new assessment underway looking purely at the different ways of valuing nature and the different values that can be ascribed to nature to take that into account when decisions are being made. And that can be everything from economic value to non-material value, all the way through to just a sense of place, a sense of identity, a sense of mental and physical well-being of being in nature, all of which is value which should be taken into account in decision making. That's it for this first episode of Nature Insight, Speed Dating with the Future. I'm Rob Spall.
And I'm Britt Garner. Next week, I'm going to chat with a young up-and-coming explorer of global biodiversity, Billy Offlin. After reading IPBES's Global Assessment Report a year ago, he set off on a 2-year-long conservation journey. Billy and I will be reflecting on his journey so far and finding out what he's learned. He had the privilege of observing a groundbreaking meeting between Indigenous leaders in Western Australia, and he'll be taking us right there next week. So make sure you subscribe to this podcast and let others know about the series if you think they would enjoy it too.
And in the meantime, you can learn more about IPBES's work on our website at www.ipbes.net or on any of our social media channels. Just search for @IPBES, that's @IPBES. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week.